9/11 changed every aspect of daily life. Something I've always found interesting is how the events of that day shaped the landscape of music going forward, whether it be albums that were released on that very day to albums released over a decade later. Today, I want to take a deep dive into 4 albums that were all in some shape, way, or form influenced, altered, or simply created by the events of September 11th. Released on September 11th, 2001, Jay-Z's 6th studio album, The Blueprint, is considered by many to be one of the greatest hip-hop albums ever produced. Chiseling himself into the sphere of mainstream rap and celebrity status, the ultimate goal of The Blueprint is exactly what the title of the album states. Jay-Z laid out the foundation for what works to make it big as a commercially successful rapper, a tracklist that can be both addicting and flashy for the radio, all while still being boisterous and larger than life in its over-the-top lyricism and unique production. The Blueprint seems to have been put together in a pretty short amount of time. The album is known to have been just cut in 2 weeks, with Jay-Z recording a handful of the tracks in only 2 days. Even though the album was released on 9/11, The Blueprint sold exceptionally well despite all the chaos that was unfolding that month. The album climbed to number 1 immediately, where it stayed for 3 weeks and sold almost 500,000 copies in its first week alone, and as of 2012 hit upwards of 2.7 million albums sold. The album resides in notable lists everywhere, from Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time list to Pitchfork's best albums of 2000 to 2004 list, and more. Despite the horrifying events of the time and the aftermath of shock and mourning, The Blueprint felt powerful and seemed to infuse a bit of energy through car radios all over the tri-state area. I can still remember being in 3rd grade when tracks like Renegade, Izzo, and Girls, Girls, Girls were being blasted all throughout Hot 97, and the album really ended up being this background playlist throughout those latter months of the 2001 year. I was pretty young at the time, but I do remember this album just always being there, whether it was being played on more of a hip-hop based radio station or something more mainstream, pop, whatever, which was obviously Jay-Z's master plan the whole time. All the older kids had a track or two burnt onto a CD on the bus. This thing was everywhere at the time. In 2018, The Blueprint was chosen by the Library of Congress to be preserved in the National Recording Registry due to its impact and influence at the time and for years to follow. The essay by Zach O'Malley Greenberg, which was added to the National Recording Registry, describes the album's importance to that month in 2001 perfectly, stating, "Jay-Z's 6th studio album arrived on September 11th, 2001, and could have been lost amid the ensuing wave of national mourning. Instead, Blueprint ended up as a soundtrack of sorts, mirroring the heady mix of pride and paranoia that permeated the post-September 11th United States. A classic album in any era, fate deposited it just in time to mirror an American moment when wound-licking gave way to a defiant indomitability." The critically acclaimed 4-part series, The Disintegration Loops, was completed simultaneously with the 9/11 attacks. Released throughout 2002 and 2003, composer William Basinski would create a compelling soundscape by digitizing multiple tape loops from years past. Initially, Basinski wanted to archive these for preservation purposes, but after he left a loop running on his digital recorder, he would return and find that the tapes was breaking down physically, resulting in a genuine, beautifully decayed terrain throughout the track. Basinski would then carry out this same procedure with other loops, eventually gathering enough material to create a complete collection of distant, ambient drone work. The Disintegration Loops feels massive sonically, sounds that seem to echo out like boats in the distance of a foggy sea, creating a world of somber sadness and dark gray clouds. It provides a very similar experience to the one found when listening to works of The Caretaker, especially stages 4 and 5 of Everywhere at the End of Time. As previously mentioned, Basinski would complete his works right around 9/11. Living in Brooklyn, New York on the day of the attacks, Basinski would make his way to the roof of the apartment building he lived in and capture Lower Manhattan through his video camera. This footage was taken right when the sun was going down, the smoke from the crumbled buildings gradually drifting away from the city skyline, capturing a time most people seem to not talk about too much when it comes to that day. Something I've always found fascinating about the days surrounding 9/11 is those periods of time, like on the night of September 11th or the couple of days that followed. There's this weird liminal presence in any footage of archived television news, radio broadcasts, or anything else you can get a hold of that captures that strange period of time where people were still too in shock to properly mourn and even think about what to do next, but just far away enough from the actual chaos of the attacks themselves. The Disintegration Loops brings that feeling to life so vividly, not just by the distant sounds of the music itself, but these captivating images used for each album of the series. The following day, on September 12th, 2001, 2001, Basinski would take all of the footage he took from late in the day before and played it simultaneously with his newly crafted digitized tape creations. When working together, Basinski soon noticed how breathtaking both the audio and visual components were, the duo gluing this project together to give the Disintegration loops true purpose and meaning. Basinski would eventually release the visuals on DVD in an incredible box set, including the music remastered for a 9 LP vinyl collection, a 5 CD collection, as well as 2 orchestral renditions that were performed. Those are on here as well. Getting your hands on one of these box sets nowadays will almost set you back $1,000, but as a record collector myself, this thing looks incredible. Clearly there was so much care and time jam-packed into this, and I would love to own one of these someday. Seeing the aftermath of the collapse of the Twin Towers, but not the actual footage of the collapse, is something that tells a whole nother story. It's interesting to think we're getting to a point in time where a solid percentage of the population wasn't alive for the attacks, and most of the time when anyone is given an explanation of what happened on that day, they're immediately shown footage of the planes going in or the chaos in the street. Projects like the Disintegration loops represent a whole other chapter in the effects of that day, a time that felt frozen due to no one really knowing what to do next. Recorded throughout 1999 and 2001, the Scottish electronic music duo Boards of Canada would end up releasing their second studio album, Geogaddi, in early 2002. The album deals with themes of numerology and overall darker feelings and references. Geogaddi is laced with vocal Easter eggs that create this cryptic complexity for the album, a much more dense and there's a lot to unpack here type of experience compared to 1998's Music Has the Right to Children. The album feels heavy and uncanny, yet beautiful at all times. Tracks like The Devil Is in the Details and Beware the Friendly Stranger I always thought felt so itchy, if that makes sense. The scratchy textures laid over playful melodies create an unnerving but strangely calm and nostalgic setting, like you're exploring an abandoned city and finding items or toys in its small schoolhouse that showcases a glimpse into an innocent past, now covered in dirt, decay, and dust. Geogaddi was said to have been produced during a chaotic period of the duo's personal lives, revealing that the events of September 11th played a massive part in influencing the aura of the album. It was a darker time for the duo during those days, and you're able to feel the bleak and gloomy tones scattered throughout almost everything on here. In an interview from 2005, Michael Sanderson, one of the 2 members of Boards of Canada, described that day in September and how the attack set a new direction for the record. Geogaddi was kind of exorcising demons, and even after we'd set out to do a record like that, smack in the middle of working on it, 9/11 happened. I remember there were a few of us in the studio that day, and we just ended up glued to the TV for the whole day. I think the months after that pushed us into making a darker record, as I'm sure it did with a lot of bands. In January of 2002, a number of listening parties were held all across the world through Warp Records to promote the release. Each party was held in a church, and the sounds were blasted loud, accompanied by decayed Super 8 film onto a large screen. After its release to the world, the duo pretty much described Geogaddi as a journey through hell, only for you to eventually make it across to the other side and escape the twisted trials that came before. Boards of Canada was able to capture a time where everyone was going through difficulties spawned from the events of 9/11, and despite the album's brittle textures and restless, fidgety composition, Geogaddi is powerful and grounded. It's a listen you don't forget. Its grip lies in its timelessness, a forever example of venturing through dark or weird times, something anyone can relate to, whether it was in 2001 or the present day. Geogaddi lingers because it exists outside of time. Boards of Canada were reacting to the sounds that they knew and the events that they saw. They seem to be reflecting on the present, the past, and the future all at once. Considered by many to be one of the greatest vaporwave albums ever made, Cat System Corp's News at 11 blends cozy, smooth jazz samples with various news and talk show clips from the day of 9/11. Released on the 15th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, Cat System Corp had already built up a well-known and beloved catalog in the vaporwave scene. Being fascinated with themes of hyper-consumerism and the 90s in general, Cat System Corp's releases followed many similar themes and sound styles to other vaporwave projects around that time. However, News at 11 attempted to take these sample material tropes and elevate it through a very interesting artistic concept. I have talked about this album so many times on this channel. I even interviewed Corp a couple years ago and we talked about News at 11. Something I find very interesting as a person who was living right across the water in New Jersey at the time, while Cat Corp truly lived across the water in Europe, is how even though we were both in such different proximities to the event of that day, both of us, and anyone for that matter, has their own unique experience experience, perceptions, and feelings on what happened. For example, my grandparents are from Sicily, so we paid extra for the Rai Italia news station growing up. For anyone who grew up in an Italian family, you know what I'm talking about. And something I'll always remember about that day was watching my grandfather watch the news and the footage that played over and over again all day of the towers falling, but on the Italian news channel. And everything was in Italian, from what was being spoken to the text on the TV screen. And even then, I realized, like, I forgot how old I was at the time. I think I was like 8 or 9 or something. But I realized how wild that must have been, like what was happening today, that it was being talked about all the way over in Italy. And News at 11 reflects on that concept and my memories of that realization even more, that this thing was just being felt everywhere. The album is pretty much broken down into 2 separate parts. The first section of the album features track titles reflecting the news, with jazzy samples accompanied with sound bites from the day. The sound bites never actually seem to make note of September 11th or any of the events that happened on that day, and to me, it always created this world in which the attacks never happened. It was like right before everything started going to shit, I don't know, the jazz music starts playing, and we're in this new alternate timeline of history, I guess. 9/11 was a super sunny day, and in this alternate reality, that sunny day continued without any disturbances. Corp pulls the sound clips away from you right before a news anchor would receive the breaking news or even announce the date, and doing so creates a new branch and timeline of American history, and I just find that whole thing really interesting. I don't know, that might not be the actual meaning of the album, but that's how I always felt about it. The last 11 tracks of the album, the second half, are all titled The Weather Channel 1 through 11. This handful of tracks contains way more commercial clips than the first half and is a real testament to the time period. And I'll admit, I always get a bit hungry when that McDonald's ad comes up. News at 11 was eventually remastered and released on this beautiful limited edition release from Geometric Lullaby. A couple variants came out of this thing, and I was actually lucky enough to be one of the first people to announce this release to the world at the time. Every year around September 11th, I always find myself throwing this album back on. There's something always so beautifully haunting about it, music that attempts to shield you from the terrors of that day. News at 11 is an incredible release that has chiseled itself as one of the most notable works to come out of the vaporwave scene. And like I said, everyone has different thoughts and ideas on what the album means or what it does for them. It's a really interesting discussion piece and a personal experience that if you haven't tried out already, definitely take the time to do so.